Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another weekly Octopi Poker stream. I am your host, Matt Hunt, as always. So thanks, everybody, for being here. And today, as you can imagine from the title, we are going to be talking about check raising the flop. So that is a request from our Discord community. It is the option that was chosen this week when I gave everybody the opportunity to have some input on what we take a look at today. So I want to start by fleshing out this topic, talking about some of the ideas that I think people get wrong about check raising. So I'm going to open up some sims here just to kind of illustrate some of this stuff, but we're, I think, primarily going to focus on some of these aspects that players tend to miss, or players tend to, kind of handle in the wrong way or treat in the wrong way, because there are a lot of misconceptions about check raising the flop. I think the first thing that comes to mind really here is that players tend to think of check raising the flop as something that you do it on some boards and you don't do it on other boards, or some boards are really good for check raising and some boards are really bad for check raising. And I think it's kind of harmful to think that way, just because in general, if you look at pretty much any spot, if the out of position player is checking a lot, if they're checking their whole range, or if they're checking a big chunk of their range, whatever it is, then they are going to always have some hands in that range that are able to check raise. They're going to have some strong hands there that are capable of putting in a raise facing a bet. So inherently, the boards where we do check everything, the boards where we are just taking a standard check all response from out of position, they are going to be boards where we're always going to be able to find check raises. And then, in fact, the boards that are the best for our range, the boards that are the strongest for our range, those are actually going to be some boards where we're probably not going to do as much check raising, because we're going to be doing a lot of leading out. We're going to be doing a lot of donk betting. So we want to keep that in mind. We want to keep it in mind that we are not necessarily going to be able to look at certain boards as being, perfect check raising spots or really bad check raising spots or whatever it is. We just want to think of check raising as something that is a natural part of our strategy in pretty much every situation where we are out of position and where we are going to at least possess some hands that can check raise effectively. So that's the first thing. We want to make sure that we're looking at check raising as just a standard, kind of an overarching part of our strategy. Welcome to the people who are in chat. Hello. Couple names I don't recognize there, which is great. Good to see some of you guys in here. Good evening from, looks like Denmark there. Awesome. Good to see you guys in there. So thank you, everybody. So let's kind of take a look at kind of illustrating that concept a little bit, right? What I'm going to talk about is the relationship between check raising and donk betting here, because I mentioned some of those boards that people tend to look at as really good check raising boards. Well, it's a lot of these low card connected boards. And in fact, the whole thing about these low card connected boards is that we're actually doing a lot of donk betting to begin with on those boards. We're not really checking our entire range. We're actually leading out because we have so much incentive to start putting money in the pot ourselves. And when we actually do face a bet, the problem and the reason why we can't check raise as much on these boards instead is because the betting range itself is not that wide, right? We're not as easily able to check raise because of the fact that the betting range itself is a bit more limited. So it kind of comes down to, you want to see check raising as the mirror image of donk betting, or the mirror image of out of position betting. And the situations where we're going to check raise a lot, it's going to be situations where, first of all, we are checking a lot ourselves, but it's also going to be situations where we expect to face a bet a lot. Because if we're not going to face a bet very often, if it's just going to go check, check at a high frequency, we have very little incentive to focus on check raising. So as you will kind of see, quite a few of the situations that we're going to check raise the most are going to be spots where, number one, we're checking everything because it's not that good of a spot for us overall. But number two, our opponent is actually betting at quite a high frequency. And we need to kind of fit both of those things in order to have the highest check raise frequencies. We need to be in a situation where we're facing a lot of bets, but we also have enough strong hands to withstand check raising. And one of the best categories of boards to illustrate this is paired boards. So if I look at this aggregate report here, hijack versus big blind, and we just go through to the c-bet line, right? What we'll do is I'll filter for any paired board. And as you can see, a lot of the paired boards, we'll get rid of the monotone flops because there's no such thing as a monotone paired board. As you can see, quite a lot of these boards have quite high frequencies for c-bets, right? We've got 77% on two-tone, 78 on rainbow. Generally, pretty decent betting frequencies for the in-position player in the hijack here on paired boards. If we look at the bet 25 line and we look at where the check raising frequencies go here, we've got the ace paired boards, so the ace x paired boards. There's a decent chunk of those, obviously, that we're going to be able to check raise sometimes, but maybe not at the highest frequencies. But if you look at the so the small raise, for example, here, right? The boards that have the highest check raise frequencies, even if you add together the small raise and the larger raise here, you've got a lot of these paired boards that have a king, an 8, a 9, a queen, boards like this where they are pretty good boards for the pre-flop raiser. They're good boards for the raiser to be betting in the first place, but they're also boards where we have quite a lot of strong hands. And if I was to, let's say we look at this king, king, deuce, right? This first example here. This is a great illustration of the type of board texture that's actually really good for check raising. Because as you can see, in position is betting all of their hands, right? It's a good enough spot for them. They have a big enough range advantage that they can just range bet here. But when they do bet, we now are in a position of having 10% of trips and 6% under pairs. So we have a lot of hands that can withstand the ability to check raise here. We have a lot of hands that have some incentive to check raise because they're strong enough to get some value there, right? So in the end, our response kind of becomes a bit divided between a lot of small check raising and not a lot of calling. We do more check raising than we do calling here. So this is a good example of a spot where we have a lot of hands that want to raise. We also have a lot of hands that want to fold, which is why our opponent bets in the first place. And we don't even have that many hands that really benefit from calling here, right? So that's the kind of the fundamental thing here, that we're not going to really see too much check raising in situations where our opponent isn't betting that often in the first place. But if our opponent is betting a lot, then there are actually going to be some situations where we check raise a lot more. So that's kind of a good overall concept to keep in mind. The other thing that I want to really focus some energy on is to be able to compare the different types of check raising strategies and ranges that we're going to have here, because I do think that players tend to get certain things a bit wide of the mark as far as how they actually construct check raises and what types of hands we look to raise. So I'm going to try to pick a pretty kind of disconnected board, like a board that we don't, I'll tell you what, let's just look here. I'm going to try to pick a board where maybe it's not that easy to just immediately know exactly what hands we're supposed to check raise. Let's see, let's go for an unpaired board. It's probably going to be better to do that. Okay, this ace-6 deuce is a good example, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up this ace-6 deuce. I'm going to duplicate the tab. I'm going to duplicate the tab again. And we're going to look at all three versions of the ace-6 deuce board. The rainbow, the two-tone, and the monotone. And we're going to see what the differences are as far as the check raises, because I think one of the areas that people tend to make mistakes in is thinking that the two-tone boards are excessively good for check raising, and then kind of forgetting to check raise on the rainbow boards, and also sort of only check raising certain specific hands on the monotone board. So we're going to look at all three versions here. We're going to load up the two-tone. Let's see, ace 6 deuce right there. And then we're going to go the, oops, ace 6 deuce. There we go. All right, so we've got all three versions of ace 6 deuce. Now, in this particular first one, we're going to see, of course, villain is range betting. And as far as the response goes, we have this sort of standard kind of 50% check raise here. We're not going too small with the check raise. And the first thing to be aware of in any individual spot is that when we're check raising, we're going to have more than one different type of category of hands in here, right? We're going to have hands that are, I actually would think it's probably best categorized as 4 different categories of hands. We have hands that are straight value, so hands that are just raising because they get called by a lot of worse hands. That's the first category. The second category is hands that are raising for value, but also because they benefit from a little bit of equity denial. So they can get some overcards to fold. The third category is going to be front door draws. So hands that have an immediate draw that can make a good hand on the turn. And then the fourth category is going to be backdoor draws. Those are going to be hands, of course, that are going to require 2 more streets in order to be able to make a good hand. So generally, in most spots, you're going to have all 4 of those categories of hands in your check raising range, particularly when you're facing a small bet in a situation like this. And by the way, guys, if you have any questions, if you have specific concepts that you want to talk about related to check raising, do drop them in the chat. Do also make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you're subscribed to the Octopi Poker YouTube channel, because we've got a lot of cool stuff coming up soon on the channel. So drop your questions, drop a like, all of that good stuff. So if we look at this as an example for those 4 categories, you can quite easily see where that value range lies as far as the check raises go. So I'm going to highlight it here on the bottom of the graphic. We've got basically the top end of the range, and as you can see, it's pretty much deuces, 6 deuce, 6s, ace 6, ace deuce, ace queen, ace jack. You know, a lot of this kind of area is maybe the bottom of the value raising range. But other than that, you know, there's just small frequencies of some of these other hands here. So that's the first category. That's the pretty clear and obvious value bet range right there. If we go below that, we then start to see a region of hands that is pretty much that equity denial kind of region. So it's not quite pure value, but it is, you know, value plus a little bit of equity denial and so on. And it's basically some of the 6x and deuce x hands. And this, I think, is an area that people miss as well. They're not really ever check raising these types of hands. They're not. So Coil Larson says, what did you do with the mouse there on the ranges on the button? I just dragged the range map at the bottom, right? So if I go to reset zoom here, the sides of the range map, if I want to focus on a specific area of the range, I can just drag the sides in, and I can focus in on a specific area that is sorted by equity. If I wanted to sort by EV, I can do that as well. But if I change it there, you can see it clearly. So Basketball Maven says, I like the old format better. What do you mean by the old format? Can you tell me a little bit about what you're referring to there? Not sure exactly what you mean. I'm just going to make sure that I just noticed there's a little bit of the screen kind of cut off on the side there. Make sure that's not showing up too much so you guys can see the whole screen. That should be good right there. Cool. So this is the second category here. This is the second category, this equity denial category of check raise. The old format for the Sims. Yeah, I'm still not sure what you mean. We haven't changed the format of the Sims. We've got the the 3D version. I don't know if you're talking about that, like making it look like this, but there hasn't been a change of the format of The Sims recently, so I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to there. But yeah, I mean, if you're referring to like the hand classes looking a bit different, that's just a product of the size of this window on my screen. It's just going to slightly condense things or slightly reduce the size there, but not a significant change. We definitely haven't changed anything substantial about the layout of The Sims. One card, Steve, if you were to hit a sell on the flop, do you bet or check to check raise? Well, that's a question that's going to be very dependent on the specifics of the situation. But for the most part, you have to start by thinking about, do I have or is this board a particularly good board for my range? And am I going to build a strategy around having hands that bet from out of position? If I don't have any hands that bet from out of position because it's not a particularly good board for me, then I'm not going to be able to justify betting sets. You don't want to just bet when you have a set and then check everything else. So we're going to take a check raise line in those cases. But kind of like I mentioned before, if you are in a position where you're expecting to face a lot of aggression when you check, because it is a bad board for you, that's of course going to allow you more opportunities to check raise. So you always want to think about your overall range. You want to think about the overall strategy that you're building there, because no hand exists in isolation. It exists as part of a range. And of course, we want to make sure that our range is playing in a way that's consistent and not excessively, predictable. So the third category now that we have after we go through those equity denial type hands is we have front door draws. And these are going to be draws that are strong enough that they can pretty much immediately hit the turn, as we mentioned. And if we look at what they are here, you can pretty much see, in fact, even some of that is backdoors. It's pretty much this category right here, I think. We've actually got some stuff that's calling here, of course, some of the king highs and queen highs, but basically we've got this 5-4, 5-3, 4-3, and so on, right? These straight draws, the low straight draws. Those are the third category here that we're going to have in that check raising range. We're going to check raise those quite a lot. And then finally, we have that bottom end category. So it's going to be hands that are mixing between some amount of continuing and folding perhaps, but it's basically all of these weak backdoors. You've got like these combo backdoors, 7-5, 7-4, 8-5, some stuff like that. Those hands are going to be in there. They're just not going to be in there at a super high frequency. So we want to just make sure that we're accounting for those. And of course, you can also see, actually, I guess I didn't include it here because they were kind of in the previous sample, but a lot of this king high and queen high stuff, you've got like queen 3, queen 4, queen 5. So two different backdoors here, a queen high backdoor flush draw and a backdoor straight draw. That sort of stuff is also going to be in there. So we've got those 4 categories of hands right there. Now this is the rainbow board, right? Now we want to also look at the two-tone board because that's going to slightly change the available hands. Villain is still able to range bet, so you'll notice that two-tone versus rainbow doesn't really have much impact on the c-bet range. And if we look at what those categories look like here, it's going to be quite consistent. It's going to be pretty similar. We've got, in this case, the value range pretty much the same area. We've got a lot of that 2-pair plus, some of the top pair once again. So again, very, very similar value range because the board is very similar. We've got this equity denial region that's going to exist again here. So we've got a lot of that second pair stuff. The only kind of caveat here is that now that there's actually a flush draw out there, some of in terms of the actual equity of certain hands, there's some overlap there with the second pair hands having a similar amount of equity. But you can kind of see where we're at there. In fact, probably the easiest way to do it now would be to look at the hand categories. So we've got second pair and third pair. That's some of the equity denial stuff. A little bit of a deuce, a little bit of 6x, some of that sort of stuff. Glad, Esync Erica, thank you for the compliment there. I appreciate that. I'm glad that you find it easier to understand me. That's awesome. Glad to hear it. Happy to have you with us. So that's the the equity denial category. We got that second category there. And then we have the draw category, right? So we've got flush draws. That's obviously going to be a big part of it. We've also got straight draws, right? Now you can see that there's quite a lot of hands in this category. We're not going to raise all of them, of course, but we do have to recognize that on a two-tone board, of course, there's plenty more in the way of draws that are available here. The other part of the equation here is the fourth category, which is the nothing and the king high. And as you can see, there is still some of that in there. There's not as much because we don't need as many of those backdoor draws when we have this front door draw that can be more available for us. But we do have stuff like king five with the king of hearts, king five of diamonds. That's actually calling a lot in there. So basically just some of these offsuit hands that have a heart in them, those are pretty good candidates as well. Those are going to be the backdoor region in this spot. So Donnie 1219, with hands that mix, do you recommend an RNG for those decisions? Generally, that's what you're supposed to do as far as how you actually execute that strategy. I think in a lot of game environments, you probably will not need to use an RNG because maybe certain factors are going to shift you more heavily in one direction than the other. But I do think it's worth recognizing that it's quite easy to take a passive line or always default to the passive line in circumstances like that when decisions are mixed. And it's also, it's very possible some players will default to the aggressive line all the time. So you don't really, even against weaker opponents, you don't really always want to be completely ignoring the possibility of using an RNG. The RNG can be very useful, and it really does help you to, first of all, moderate your frequencies, but also to reduce some of the cognitive load a little bit, just to make your decisions a little bit easier and allow you to focus your energy on some of the aspects that are really more important as far as the later streets and so on. So RNG usage, definitely a handy thing to get used to for sure. So we've seen on the ace-6 deuce with the flush draw here that when there's a flush draw out there, when there's a front door flush draw, it's a lot easier to find those draws to raise, and we don't have to worry as much about those backdoors. Now, if I want to focus in a little bit on the flush draw and the combo draw region, the first thing that you can notice about these flush draws is that the ones that have the combo draw are, of course, a lot more likely to check raise. We've got the 5-4, the 5-3, 4-3, all of that is basically always check raising. So if we have that combo draw, very good raising spot. The other thing to notice is that the ones that have a backdoor straight draw in the form of just having a 5 or having a 4 or having a 3, those are quite happy to raise as well. However, if we were to look at the way that some of these specific cards are going to play, we can see that there's a little bit of a tendency to avoid wanting to have maybe an 8 or a 7 or a 9 in our hand here, and to prefer to have a king high or maybe particularly a queen high or a jack high, something like that. And this is all to do with the amount of hands that our opponent is going to fold to this check raise that exist within their range. They have more king hands than they do queen hands. So when we have a king in our hand, it makes it slightly less likely that we're going to raise and get a fold. Whereas when we have a queen, a jack, and so on, those are some of the best combos for us to have because they are unblocking some bet folds, but they're also blocking a couple of bet calls. So you can see there's a couple of trends here, but generally I think the important kind of rule of thumb here is that we want to check raise draws that also have some kind of additional equity on top of just the draw. And a lot of the draws that are just a basic flush draw that doesn't have any other kind of straight draw or anything like that, a lot of those are going to play quite passively here. And then in particular, if you look at the strongest draws, the nut flush draws that also have a good kicker here, king, queen, king, jack, king, 10, those hands are not really raising at all here. And the reason for that is because it's actually quite hard for them to get anything better to fold by raising. They can't really get a better king high to fold by raising because there aren't really any. There aren't very many, right? So even like king 5 has more reason to raise than king queen does. So that's the way to look at some of those draws there. So this is the ace-6 deuce with a flush draw. So we've kind of seen similar principles, but we're shifting a little bit more into wanting to use those front door draws and not really worrying as much about the back doors. Then, if we look at ace-6 deuce monotone, well, this is not a range bet board for in position. It's not as good of a board for them, so we do have to be mindful of that. And the important thing about monotone boards here is, as you can see, there's a lot less check raising. We're not doing anywhere near as much check raising here, only about 10% compared to something in the 15-16% region for the previous one. And if we look at how we're actually building out this check raising range, there's a couple of things that are very different here. If we look at the value range, first of all, the value range is going to change quite a lot. And as you can see, it's basically, oh, Donnie, no worries. Happy to have you here. Appreciate it. And we'll see you back later. If you look at the top end here, the value range is totally different, right? If we look at the stuff that was value raising before, deuces is still kind of in there. 6 is kind of in there, but ace deuce not really raising, ace 6 not really raising. So we really aren't raising much two pair anymore. We're definitely not raising ace jack, ace queen, that sort of stuff. So completely different value raising range. And for the most part, the hands that we are raising are flushes, right? That's the value range, or at least a lot of those flushes are part of this value range. And in particular, it's the ones that have a high card and a low card. So we like to be unblocking a lot of those medium flushes. So we want our opponent to be able to have something like 9-8 of hearts, that sort of area. We don't really want to check raise as many of the low flushes here. So that's the first major difference here, that it's the flushes that become a big part of the value range. The second major change is that this idea of having 4 categories is not quite as prevalent, not quite as significant. Because as you can see, in fact, let me just do it this way. Reset zoom. As you can see, there's very, very little of that equity denial stuff anymore in there. Tiny, tiny bit of some second pair and third pair, but really very little of the equity denial going on. So that second category doesn't really exist here. It's actually more of a polar check raising approach. Yeah, excuse me. Sorry, need some coffee. It's more of a polar check raising approach here. So it's not going to have so much of that equity denial in there. And then if we look at that third category down, well, previously it was front door draws. Well, the whole thing about this spot is that, of course, there are front door draws, but there's a big difference between a front door flush draw and any kind of other draw. So now what we have is, because there's no back door, we basically have 2 categories of draws that kind of divide quite cleanly. We've got combo draw / front door flush draw, which is like king of hearts 4, king of hearts 5, stuff like this that has the nut flush draw plus a backdoor straight draw. You've got other single heart hands. A lot of these offsuit hands that have 1 heart in there are going to be very reasonable check raises. So you've got those front door draws that are in the form of the flush draw. And then the bottom category here is actually going to be those hands that have a draw to the straight here. Now, this is a front door draw, obviously, but it's a very significantly weaker front door draw because the straight is just going to lose to any flush. So generally, that bottom end category here is going to pretty much replace the back doors. We've got draws that still are drawing dead against a flush. Those are the weakest draws that we can have here. So that's going to be the 4 categories on this board. And largely, that's going to sort of dictate what happens on a monotone board here. We're just going to shift those categories around. The other thing that I want to make sure that we address is not only what happens when we face a small bet, but what happens when we face a big bet. Because the size of the bet is going to have quite a big influence on the overall nature of the spot. So I'm going to try to find a situation here where we face kind of an equal frequency of small bet and medium-sized bet, right? So let's say this is a pretty good one. Ace Jack 8 That's not bad. Oh, king, queen, 10. This is a good one. So we've got king, queen, 10 here, right? We face a fair amount of small bet and a fair amount of big bet here. Pretty kind of consistent frequencies of both. And I want to take a look at how we're constructing against each of these sizes, right? So against the small bet, a lot of the same principles are going to apply here. We don't have a ton of check raising because this isn't a great board for us. But as far as the different categories go, well, you can see right here, we have the value region at the top end, which is straights, some two pairs, basically just anything that really heavily interacts with this specific top end board. Then we've got some stuff a little below that, which is going to be a bit of kind of equity denial, not completely equity denial because we're not really folding out a ton of stuff, but you can see it's like thin value, King X, even a little bit of Queen X in there. So there's little bits and pieces of those hands. And then we have the bluffs here that basically exist in this drawing region. And you can see it's a lot of Jack X and Ace X. Now you could probably divide it in this spot and say, well, the Jack X are the strong draws, the Ace X are the weaker draws. But of course, there's a lot of those draws here. So this is kind of going to just sort of split quite cleanly between those hands. Now, this is against the small bet, obviously. So the principles are going to be very similar against the small bet. Against the big bet, we're going to start to see some stuff change. Because against the big bet, now it's a lot harder to get away with the same kind of check raising range, right? And in this case, there's actually a pretty significant change in the frequency. We go from check raising, I think what were we raising before? We were raising like, let's see, 11%. So, not super high frequency, but there is some of it in there. And now we're only raising 7%, right? So we go down from 11 to 7. And if you look at the different regions of hands here, the straights, two pairs and sets, they're still raising a bit, but even there's a lot of trapping. There's a lot of slow playing going on there with those hands. So we're not even always raising the strongest hands in our range, first of all. And then if we look at everything below that, well, there's almost none of that thin value top pair. There's almost no second pair. There's no third pair. Pretty much nothing in that area that's any kind of thin value, right? So that thin value portion is pretty much disappearing when we're facing a larger bet size. And that is quite important here. We start to get to a point where we're much more clearly defined as value and then some draws. And if we look at the ace high and the straight draw region, once again, we do have a couple of different categories of draws here, but in fact, the frequencies have gone way down. There's very limited check raising with just an ace here. Only ace deuce specifically with a backdoor is at a decently high frequency. And then even with a jack, we're not raising a ton. Jack deuce is the only hand that's like always raising here because that deuce is going to be an unblocker for a lot of their bet fold hands. But you can really see here that we're not doing anywhere near as much check raising. We're not really going with anywhere near as much aggression against the larger bet. And this is part of why the larger bet makes sense for our opponent. They can bet this size because they don't really get raised a lot, So it sort of all matches together in that way. So we've got an idea of how the board texture is going to affect things and how the range is constructed. We've also got an idea of how the bet size is going to affect things. What I also want to finally cover here is how we're going to approach this when we are the pre-flop raiser and we're taking an out of position check raise line as opposed to when we are the pre-flop caller in the big blind. So I'm going to look at a hijack versus button spot here. And again, I'm going to go for a situation where we are, fold right there. I'm going to go for a situation where we are basically checking everything on the flop. So I'm going to find, let's go with this 7-5-4 flop. This is a nice example here. So connected board, two-tone board. We're going to look at, we're checking in the hijack. We're checking everything. We're not doing any betting from out of position. And we're going to face a bet of usually about quarter pot here. Let's see how our check raise strategy looks here. Well, there's a couple of interesting things going on right away. The first thing is that we are actually check raising quite a bit here, 20% frequency. But we're not check raising very big. So they bet, what did they bet? They bet 1.2-ish or something here. They bet 25% on the flop at least. And then we raise 30%, right? So They bet 1.8 and we raised to 5. Okay. So we're raising less than 3x their bet, which is going to allow us to have a pretty diverse range here. And this is quite a common thing as the pre-flop raiser. It's that we are more or less going to have a more diverse range, a more kind of balanced range, varied range when we're the pre-flop raiser here. It's not going to be as easy for us to just kind of maybe be a bit more polarized or just focus on value and then draws and so on, right? It's a lot harder to really delineate here exactly which parts of the range are preferring to check raise or preferring to call here, because in fact, we pretty much have a mix of all kinds of different hands in that check raising range. There are a few categories that aren't really raising very much. You know, we can see like the under pair is not raising here. We're not raising threes or deuces. But even third pair, you know, there's a little tiny shred of 4x that's raising there. So really what we can do here is divide it between categories in a similar way, but just understand that the dividing lines are a lot closer, right? So we've got straights, we've got sets, we've got two pairs. This is the value region. But again, we're not always going to be able to check raise these hands. We have to make sure that our check calling range is not excessively capped or too restricted into, you know, very specific types of hands, ace highs, you know, something like that. So we have to have a little bit of some balance in there. We have to, you know, just kind of moderate our frequencies and make sure that we don't go overboard with them. Then we have the next category down, which would be one pair hands, which would be over pair, top pair, under pair, second pair, third pair, low pair. And as you can see, the low pair we've already talked about, but everything else, the over pairs are mixing a lot of raises here. Everything from eights up to aces is raising sometimes and calling sometimes, simply because this is a board texture where if they do raise, the downside is that they're not even that far ahead of a lot of the hands that call. If you have jacks or something here and you check raise and you get called, you're getting called by a range of hands that you are doing okay against, but you're not crushing by any means. You can see jacks only has about 65-68% equity here. So it's not exactly a super nutted hand by any means. And that's going to cause us to want to play these types of hands fairly cautiously here to begin with. There's not going to be too many hands that are an obvious trivial check raise here. So all of these one pair hands are pretty much going to be in a mixing situation there. And they're not going to have a huge incentive one way or the other. Then we go below that, we go to ace high and king high, and you can imagine that some of the hands that have a straight draw are a little bit more happy to raise, so ace 8, king 6, ace 6, that sort of stuff, king 8, ace 8. So that's going to make logical sense here, but we're really not doing a lot of raising with those categories. And then we get to the draws. So we get to combo draw, flush draw, straight draw. And as you can see, the draws are pretty important here. We focus primarily on the combo draws to begin with. You can see those combo draws are very happy to raise. There's a lot of raising going on with this category as a whole. So we're happy to put money in when we have all that equity. If we look at basic flush draws, then we actually are kind of prioritizing the ones that are, you know, two sort of medium cards here, more so than something like king queen or ace king or ace queen, because these hands have the ability to get better hands to fold. If we have 10-9 and we check raise and we get, you know, jack 10 to fold, that's a really good outcome. But if we check raise ace 10 and we get jack 10 to fold, that's a bad outcome, right? And then we have the straight draws, which if we are kind of focused on the ones that don't have the flush draw, let's actually just highlight everything that isn't a club here. So straight draws without a club. You can see we're not doing a ton of raising with those, mostly just king 6 to fold out some better king highs, a little bit of the A-tax as well. So not a ton going on there. And then as far as the nothing goes, the very bottom of our range, there's very, very little of it. We've got like a little bit of queen 9, 10-9, jack 9 of diamonds, but we're not really check raising a ton of absolute nothing there. So as far as the pre-flop raiser spots go, we are definitely in some very different territory because we have to be a little bit more diverse, a little bit more balanced. We're not going to be up against a particularly aggressive flop strategy here. So we're not, you can see that the in-position player is not betting their entire range here. They're not able to just automatically bet everything when we check to them. And it's because of that we're forced to be a bit more conservative with that check raising range, and we're forced to be very diverse, very balanced as far as how we go with it. I think there's quite a nice little hack to figure out what your check raising range is supposed to look like here, which is to think about it as if you were putting this amount of money in the pot as a bet instead of a check raise, what kind of construction of range would you want to have here? So in this case, if you were just going to bet 5 big blinds instead of they bet 1.8 and then you raise to 5 big blinds, what range would you want to have, or what range would you have to have? And in this case, you would have to have a pretty balanced, well-rounded range because of the nature of the board. Yana says, how do check raise ranges change with deeper stacks, like in a cash game situation? That's a good question. Let me just take a quick look at how to illustrate that to you guys. The short version is that the construction of the range is not going to change a ton. You're still going to have the similar concepts in mind, but what you will find is that as the stacks get deeper, the incentive to raise for value and grow the pot is going to slightly reduce with the hands that are not, super strong value. So if I look at some of these shallower stack sizes, let's say we went all the way to like 20 big blinds, right? If I go to 20 big blinds, hijack big blind, you're going to see now that at 20 big blinds, there's a lot of board textures where, let's say we look at just a random, let's actually go back to the ace 6 deuce here. That's probably a good example here. Ace, where's the ace 6 deuce? Okay, so first of all, villain is actually supposed to bet bigger on this board sometimes because we don't have a lot of ace X. But if we look at 20 big blinds, where are we at? Okay, so we have a slightly different range here because we're not calling certain hands pre-flop. The ranges are changing, but you can kind of see that now ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, ace 7 are pretty happy to raise here. So the hands that are strong enough, or the threshold of hands that are strong enough to raise for value, has come down. The construction of the range is actually still very similar. You can see the straight draws, you can see the backdoors are still in there. So the same principle is still in play as far as how we construct our range on this board compared to at deep stacks. It's just that the value threshold has changed a bit now, right? We're actually value raising like ace 7 plus a lot of the time. And part of that is because we don't have as many ace X hands pre-flop. But if I look at like, let's try 30 big blinds, because that's going to be a stack size where we're not necessarily, we're still going to have a pretty similar range to what we would at 60. So let's try and see how this looks. Okay, so B25 a lot. That's good. Yeah, okay, pretty similar to what we saw at 60, right? So we've got ace 6s in there, ace 10, ace jack, deuces. Not ace deuce. Ace deuce is just trapping, which is a little interesting. But you can see the construction is very, very similar there. You still have the straight draws. We still are going to have those backdoors as well, as you can see right there. So I think the way to look at it as far as stack sizes go is that the construction of the range is not going to dramatically change. In fact, if anything, you're going to start to see the frequencies go down a little bit because there's fewer hands that are going to be able to stack off. But as you get deeper and deeper and deeper, you're also going to just have to take into account the changes in the defending range, right? Because as you're getting deeper, you're not going to be defending as many hands. You're not going to be defending the same types of really weak offsuit hands that you are when you're very shallow. So the nature of the pre-flop ranges is going to alter the spot. It's going to alter how the spot plays out. And we're going to have to keep that in mind just as much as we keep in mind the fact that the stacks are deeper. So there's a lot of things that change, but the principles of how we construct the ranges are going to stay very consistent. We have those different regions of hands that are going to be in there. And we always want to focus on, the fact that the range that we're going to check raise is not going to we're not really going to ever want to shift it to a point where it somehow becomes super value heavy or super bluff heavy or anything like that. Like, it's going to be a well-rounded range no matter what at every stack size. And it's just a question of where that value range is, where that threshold is, and how that's going to change as the stack sizes alter there. So hopefully that answers the question there. So we've kind of talked about a few different things. One thing that I would say in general here, just to sort of wrap the discussion a little bit, is that you always want to keep in mind that concept that we talked about at the beginning, which is the relationship between donk betting and check raising. And that's true for donk betting. It's true for out of position C betting. It's true for any kind of a situation. It's all going to come down to how much money does the out of position player want to put into this pot. If the out of position player is going to put in a lot of money, then they're probably going to want to do that by betting and not by check raising, because if it's very favorable for their range, the in position player isn't going to bet very often. But if the in position player is going to bet a lot, they want to check so they can check raise. So Yana says, maybe in summary, still balanced, but more mindful of potential reverse implied odds. Yes, I don't think reverse implied odds is that useful of a concept, because it kind of implies, it sort of implies that we make mistakes, right? Which of course we do, but like, we don't want to make the assumption of like, I'm not going to make this play because I think I'm going to make mistakes if I make this play. I think the better way to look at it is just that as stack sizes get deeper, the threshold of how much equity you need in order to stack off is going to go up. And therefore, the threshold at which it becomes a good decision to reopen the betting action and grow the pot on this street compared to calling and just realizing equity and seeing the next street, that's going to change as the stack sizes change. And that's the main variable that's going to make a real impact there, a little bit more so than implied odds or reverse implied odds. I think that people tend to generally make too much of those concepts because, you know, they sort of imply that, you know, we make a good hand and we just can't get away from it, and, you know, we just get stacked or something. Like, it's a little bit of an old-timey, old-school sort of concept. It's useful, but it's not something that I would think that is going to really guide our strategy that much if we're, you know, making good decisions across a few streets. So, like I say, keep your eye on that idea of aggression frequencies changing and the board being, you know, more favorable for one player, less favorable for another. And don't fall into the trap of doing a lot of betting on boards where if you check, you're going to face a bet very often anyway. And also don't fall into the trap of checking with the attempt to check raise on a board where if you check, you're not going to face a bet very often, right? Because checking and then just having it go check, check all the time, not really ideal. So that's kind of the way that I would look at that. Glad that makes sense, Yana. Thank you for the questions. So thanks, everybody. I think that's going to be a good spot to wrap it up for today. We went our usual 45 minutes. Don't want to go too long and confuse you guys. But thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate all of you. We will be back again next week. And if you're in the Discord, jump in there and I will... oh, actually, I completely forgot. I have something cool for you guys. Next week, I think it's going to be next week. It could be delayed, but I think it's going to be next week. We're going to be doing a special session here where it's going to be themed around how to study effectively, right? So it's just going to be an overall kind of big picture guide of how to build your study process, how to get the most out of Octopi, how to use solver tools effectively. So make sure you're here for that one, because that will be a really useful tool for you guys. And it's going to be very much geared at giving everybody the chance to really get the most out of these types of tools. So thanks, everybody, for being here. I appreciate all of you in the chat. It's always nice to have you guys keeping me company on a Friday morning here. So thank you, everybody. I will see you guys next time. And of course, if you're in the Discord and you're taking part in our weekly challenges, then I'll see you in there as well. So thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.